Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. I'm Dick Clay. I'm the president and CEO of the Filson Historical Society. Thank you again for joining us for today's program. It's A New Birth in Freedom, commemorating Juneteenth in Kentucky with Dr. Patrick Lewis. And of course, it could not come at a more wonderful time, and that is the recognition, the approval, and the signing into law of a bill that makes Juneteenth a national holiday. Our speaker is Dr. Patrick Lewis. Dr. Lewis is the Director of Collections and Research here at the Filson. He's a Trigg County native. He graduated from Transylvania University, and he holds a Ph.D. in history from the University of Kentucky. He has worked for the National Park Service and for the Kentucky Historical Society, and has won digital history grants for from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Lewis is the author of For Slavery and Union, Benjamin Buckner and Kentucky Loyalties in the Civil War, which was published in 2015. I'll return to moderate questions with him after the presentation as time permits. Now, if you would join me in welcoming the Filson's Dr. Patrick Lewis. Patrick.
Thanks so much, Dick, for the wonderful introduction. I'm jealous that I'm not on that side of the coin today. I'm normally hosting and asking questions, but you all are fortunate enough to get me for a full hour. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got some slides that will help us illustrate our talk today. There we go. I want to start with a recently donated document which illustrates how freedom came, and that very rarely, for enslaved Kentuckians before 1865, by a rare and public action of their enslavers. This is the manumission document of Sarah Dixon, who was emancipated in Louisville in June of 1842. She married another freedman, Clark Coleman, that same year, and they went on to make new lives for themselves, eventually across the Ohio River in Indiana, where their descendants who donated that document to us just recently continue to live. But the reality was that slavery persisted, and it boomed even after the strengthening of the bonds of the Fugitive Slave Law and the Compromise of 1850, the expansion of cotton cultivation into the Old Southwest and what we would consider the West today, into Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas. We see here a picture from the Filson's collections of a slave auction being conducted on Cheapside in Lexington, actually at the moment where human beings are being bought and sold. But as Dick mentioned, this year we have a federal holiday to commemorate emancipation at the end of the Civil War. That holiday, Juneteenth, is brought to us by this fellow, a Union Army general named Gordon Granger, who's buried in Lexington Cemetery, who read a departmental order on June 19th, 1865 to a crowd of refugees in Galveston, Texas. He said that by virtue of the Emancipation Proclamation, they were free. And in fact, they had been free, in theory, since January 1st, 1863. Of course, they had also been under the control of Confederate sympathizing masters until that time. So while they had been free in theory, they were not free in fact. There's been a recent excellent book on Juneteenth by someone who grew up experiencing that, and who then later pursued a career as a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, Annette Gordon Reed. She was a local Texan, and she talks about her lived experience of this holiday growing up. It started out as a local holiday for Black Texans to commemorate this moment of their liberation. And then that spread out and became more national celebration as Black Texans spread across the country during what we know as the Great Migration. And Dr. Gordon Reed points out that for Black Texans, the Juneteenth was a counterpoint to the upcoming 4th of July. a pair of historical celebrations that opened the summer, brought families together, barbecue, cookout, fireworks, all of the like. I'm going to read a little bit from her book here. She says, that day appeared to me as the first part of a 1-2 summer punch. June 19th followed closely by July 4th, the holiday for all Americans. As far as I knew, whites did not celebrate Juneteenth during my childhood, but everyone in my area celebrated the 4th. Juneteenth was different. For my great-grandmother, my grandparents, and the relatives of their generation, this was the celebration of the freedom of people they had actually known. My great-grandmother's mother had been married 3 times, outliving all of her husbands. Her last one had been enslaved until the end of the Civil War. Slavery was just a blink of an eye away from the years my grandparents and their friends were born. Although I was angered by the stories I heard about their lives under Jim Crow, and I had my own issues about the treatment of Blacks in my lifetime, they surely compared life as it was, knowing what it could have been but for the Civil War, the Emancipation, Proclamation, and General Order No. 3. Although there was a very long way to go before we had full and equal citizenship, we were able to gather together as a family to celebrate. Family members who were lost to death. No one was being sold away. This distancing of Black Americans from the 4th of July had really long roots. Frederick Douglass, 13 years before the first Juneteenth in 1852, gave one of his most quotable speeches. He told a crowd, "Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought light and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice. I must mourn. To drag a man in fetters into the grand illuminated temple of liberty and call upon him to join you in joyous anthems were inhumane mockery and sacrilegious irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgivings, with all your religious parade and solemnity are, to him, mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour." Juneteenth, Dr. Gordon Reed tells us, from someone who grew up with the holiday, was a moment to remember the Black history not taught in segregated white schools or in the schools which were being integrated. The future Dr. Gordon Reed, the first Black student to integrate her local school system. And as students like Dr. Gordon Reed integrated schools, white students with the means to do so often fled out of them, leading to a continued segregation of curriculum, an incomplete knowledge of the story of emancipation and the war that preceded it. We're going to read now from another recent historian, memoirist. We've had a rich crop of these this year. From the other side of the color line, Brigadier General Ty Sedgley, retired chair of the West Point History Department. He's worth reading about the deep-seated nostalgia and myth-making about the Confederacy, which exists among white Southerners. These are sentiments that resonated with me very, very personally. General Sedgley says, born on July 3rd, worshiping Robert E. Lee, graduated from a segregation academy in the same town as the last mass lynching in American history, went to Washington and Lee University to become an educated Christian Virginia gentleman, became an Army officer like my heroes, Washington and Lee, served at posts named for Confederates, and lived on Lee Road at West Point. My entire life led me to worship slave-owning traitors. At the lectern in Lee Chapel at Washington and Lee, at an invited address a few years ago, he says, "I told the crowd that Lee and his fellow Confederates refused to accept the outcome of a fair democratic election. The Southern states seceded to protect and expand slavery. Framed by Lee's portrait to the left and his statue to the rear, I argued on Constitution Day that Lee had violated Article 3, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution. Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them." Then I told the audience that the reason he fought against the United States was not complicated. Lee believed in racial control through slavery. He fought to create a slave republic because he believed in slavery. A simple argument. A few months prior to my talk in Lee Chapel, I sat on the dais at West Point's graduation. The speaker that year was Secretary of Defense James Mattis. One phrase in his speech resonated with me, and I used it during my talk. "We Americans aren't made of cotton candy," Mattis said. Darn right. Americans defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Americans went to the moon. Americans, including African-American soldiers, emancipated 4 million women, men, and children. Americans can and will confront our past, survive, and thrive. We will make a better, more inclusive society for our children and our grandchildren. I believe in this country. Which is why Juneteenth is now a federal holiday. What Juneteenth means for all people, I think, of whatever racial identity, with roots in Texas, in the South, or anywhere, is to recognize that freedom did not come with the stroke of a presidential or a constitutional pen. It had to be asserted, claimed, and fought for, even after it was theoretically granted. And it still has to be. That having been said, it's important that we understand the process of emancipation on the ground to understand how it overlapped with and differed from the Juneteenth story of Texas. In every single state, the process unfolded differently. So I'm going to offer a few dates that might stand in as Kentucky Juneteenths. Our first one is very early, and I don't think is a leading candidate. February 29th, 1864. This was the day that Black men were officially allowed to enlist in the Union Army in Kentucky. They had been able to do so for almost a year in other states, but Kentucky was a holdout because of slave-owning politicians in the Unionist state government who resisted that move from the Lincoln administration. This opens the door for men like William Wright here from Franklin, Kentucky, to join the 114th United States Colored Infantry. This importantly brought freedom to the soldier himself, but it created a seriously perilous situation for his relatives who were still enslaved in the loyal slave state of Kentucky. I'm going to read to you from a letter from a colonel of one of those regiments, a white officer commanding Black troops, the 107th United States Colored Infantry, to his corps commander in February of 1865. He says, all the men of the regiment were recruited in Kentucky. A large proportion of them were slaves previous to entering the service. A large number of them have families still remaining in servitude, who are most shamefully and inhumanely treated by their masters in consequence of their husbands having enlisted in the Union Army. It is the highest ambition of a large number to mitigate and relieve their wants by remittances, whereby some of the necessary wants and comforts of life may be given them. A moment's reflection will prove to anyone that it is impossible under the existing circumstances to alleviate their wants in the slightest degree. Unable to read or write, they are entirely dependent upon their masters for any information they may receive from husbands and friends who are in the service. In a great many instances, letters have been returned with some miserable, contemptible expression written by a miserable Southern sympathizer in regard to the service they have entered, probably stating that their families do not require relief. Under such circumstances, it would be extremely unsafe to forward money to their families for the reason that it will fall into the hands of those who are wholly unprincipled and would benefit no one. Propose another important date, March 3rd, 1865, a year after Black men in Kentucky could enter the Army. This was the day where families of Black men who enlisted in the U.S. Army could be freed by virtue of their husbands' or fathers' enlistment. This is recognizing the difficulties and dangers in the situation that Colonel Sells laid out before. This did not stop the inhumane treatment of the families of soldiers, though. I'm going to read from an affidavit filed by a woman named Clarissa Burdett, who was freed by virtue of her husband's enlistment, but her lived experience is very much the opposite. This is from March 27th, 1865. I am a married woman and have 4 children. My husband, Elijah Burdett, is a soldier in the 12th United States Colored Heavy Artillery. I and my children belong to Smith Alford, Garrett County, Kentucky. When my husband enlisted, my master beat me over the head with an axe handle, saying as he did so that he beat me for letting Eli Burdett go off. He bruised my head so that I could not lay it against a pillow without the greatest pain. Last week, my niece, who lived with me, went to Camp Nelson. This made my master very angry, and last Monday, March 20th, he asked me where the girl had gone. I could not tell him. He then whipped me over the head and said he would give me 200 lashes if I did not get the girl back before the next day. On Wednesday last, March 22nd, he said that he had not time to beat me on Tuesday, but now he had time and he would give it to me. He then tied my hands, threw a rope over a joist, stripped me entirely naked, and gave me about 300 lashes. I cried out. He then caught me by the throat and almost choked me, then continued to lash me with switches until my back was all cut up. After he whipped me on Wednesday last, he said he would give me until next morning to bring the girl back. And if I did not get her back by that, he would give me as much more. I knew that I would be whipped, so I ran away. My master frequently said that he would be jailed before one of his Negroes would go to camp. I therefore knew he would not permit any of my children to come with me. So when I ran away, I had to leave my children with my master. One of the saving graces for enslaved people in Kentucky in early 1865 was the arrival of John Palmer into command of the Department of Kentucky. Palmer was born in Scott County, and he grew up in Christian County until about 1831, when he was around 14 years old, when his family moved to Illinois. He had then made a career for himself as a lawyer and politician, first as an anti-slavery Democrat, and then evolving into a Republican. He was one of President Lincoln's electors in the state of Illinois in 1860. When the war came, Palmer raised the 14th Illinois Infantry, and then took command of the Department of Kentucky after Stephen Burbridge was relieved of command in the state early in 1865. Palmer was given a handful of tasks, the first one of which was defeating the guerrilla insurgency, which had sprung up in the state in the year following Black recruitment in 1864 and 1865, an insurgency very much fueled by white resentment over the recognition that emancipation was coming. He had to manage emancipation, and he had to look ahead to reincorporating the returning Confederates who would be coming back into the state after their armies surrendered in the middle of the year. Palmer, in May of 1865, issued a really important general order. This one on May 11th, 1865, another one of those dates that we might consider for a Kentucky Juneteenth. And in short, he prefaced it by saying that large numbers of refugees, many of them women and children, had come to Louisville and, quote, have been compelled to seek shelter where they could find a place, and that by reason of the crowded state of the city and the scarcity of houses, they have crowded together in numbers so great at each place as to render disease almost certain. And smallpox is now, from the cause aforesaid, prevailing in several localities in the city among these people. All colored persons in the city of Louisville are advised at once to seek employment, and such as are unable to find sufficient employment for the support of their families in the city are advised to seek it elsewhere. To enable them to do so, here's the controversial part, it is ordered that the provost marshal of the post of Louisville, upon the application of any colored person, will issue a pass to such colored person and for his or her family. Conductors and managers of all railroads, steamboats, ferry boats, and other means of travel out of and from the city of Louisville will, upon the presentation of such pass and the payment of the usual fare, transport the persons named therein. This led to widespread confusion, quite frankly, by both Black Kentuckians and white Kentuckians about the line between these passes which allowed the free transit of refugees from slavery who were still legally enslaved and documents granting actual emancipation. In this ambiguous state of being practically free, but still legally bound in slavery, a delegation of Black leaders wrote to President Andrew Johnson in June of 1865. They said, "Kentucky is the only spot within all the bounds of the United States where the people of color have no rights whatever, either in law or in fact, and where the strong arm of military power no longer to curb her, if Palmer were relieved of command, in short, her jails and workhouses would groan with the numbers of our people immured within their walls, the very moment the government ceases to shield us with the broad aegis of her power. We most humbly petition and pray you that you will not remove martial law from the state of Kentucky, nor her noble military commander, Palmer, under whose protection we have almost learned to realize the blessings of a home under the safeguard and sanction of law. The state of Kentucky has contributed of her colored sons over 30,000 soldiers who have poured out their blood lavishly in defense of their country and their country's flag. And we confidently hope this blood will be carried to our credit in any political settlement of our native state." Perhaps the most important day in the summer of 1865, symbolically, for the end of slavery was the 4th of July, to bring it back around to Douglass's speech. In light of the extension of Palmer's travel pass order, there was a widespread expectation by Black Kentuckians that Palmer would announce their full freedom on the 4th, though he denied it to any white business and community leaders, and believe me, there were a bunch, who came outraged to see him in his office downtown. Regardless, refugees flooded into Louisville from all across the state, expecting a Juneteenth moment. They didn't know about Juneteenth, of course, but expecting that this would be the final moment. And Palmer blundered into one of the most interesting spectacles that he possibly could. One of the celebrations that white Louisvillians had organized for the 4th of July was the reading of the Declaration of Independence out at the fairgrounds, which is now over in Crescent Hill. And there was a circus in town, which, as part of their show, had a golden chariot and 4 matching horses. And so they offered to give Palmer a lift out to the fairgrounds and back into town. As he's riding back into town after the reading of the Declaration out at the fairgrounds, he starts running into the beginnings of a crowd. Tens of thousands of Black Kentuckians have gathered. They'd erected a stage even on the outskirts of town. And we're not entirely sure where this took place. Palmer, in his memoirs, mentions that it was in a grove of trees outside of town. He mentions heading south on Preston and then crossing 10th Street, which don't meet. So I've got a couple of theories about where this might be. If he had turned west at some point and crossed 10th Street, then it might have been out at the old Oakland Racecourse, which was being used as a cavalry horse refitting stable. If he'd stayed on Preston and kept heading south, the city ended in a public recreation area near the old Hebrew cemetery called Knapp's Garden. It was a site of a tavern, a grove of trees, and a target range used for shooting competitions. It's now more or less on the kind of southern end of Shelby Park neighborhood south of Ormsby. In either case, these locations aren't far from U.S. Army fortifications that ringed the outside of the city and are likely locations for refugee shantytowns to have sprung up from these refugees from slavery coming to Louisville who seek military protection to protect them from harassment by local police and sheriffs and things like that. Regardless, when they pull up to this stage, the crowd thrusts Palmer up onto it, and he makes a little speech, and he says, "My countrymen, you are substantially free." He says, but they never heard the word substantially. And there went up such a shout, which could have been heard for a mile. Some were singing and shouting as if they were in a religious meeting. How long I stood on the platform, I do not know. But when the noise in a measure subsided, I said, "My countrymen, you are free. And while I command in this department, the military forces of the United States will defend your right to freedom." He said, "Nothing like the scene I then witnessed will ever occur again in the United States, for human slavery had ceased to exist. Slavery practically ended on July 4th, 1865. Now, that's the way he chose to remember it when he's writing his memoirs, but he knew that wasn't true at the time. On July 29th, Palmer wrote a letter to President Lincoln explaining himself, explaining what had happened on the 4th of July, explaining Order Number 32, explaining the demographics of unfreedom that still existed in Kentucky at the time in the summer. Palmer estimated that at the time of his 4th of July proclamation, the following number of Kentuckians were still enslaved. He says about 230,000 had been enslaved before the war began. About 28,000 had enlisted in the Army and the Navy. Assuming 2.5 dependent family members per man, about 72,000 women and children had been freed. If we go ahead and assume that 3.5 family members had been freed for each enlistee, that would have made over 100,000. And he points out that 1/2 of the remainder of people in bondage had belonged to rebels and so were free by virtue of the confiscation acts, leaving somewhere between 50 and 65,000 legally enslaved Kentuckians, even if they were in a position to exercise their freedom, even if they were part of this massive refugee community that had settled around Louisville, Lexington, Camp Nelson, anywhere the U.S. Army was present. And the majority of white political leaders in the state were intent on keeping them that way. Palmer was sued in courts all across the state for aiding slaves to escape because of these free transportation and pass laws that he had passed in General Orders Number 32 and 49. Including in Bourbon Circuit Court, he was sued by sitting Congressman Brutus Clay for aiding the escape of 40 people at $1,000 each, and by sitting Senator Garrett Davis for 10 enslaved people at the same price. This state of uncertainty, of ambiguity, of danger, quite frankly, for the refugee population and insecurity lasted throughout 1865 until 3 final days, 3 final candidates for Kentucky's Juneteenth, December 5th through 7th, 1865. One of those indictments that had been found against General Palmer was in Louisville. George W. Johnston was the circuit court judge. He had previously been the police judge in Louisville and had been elected to the circuit court bench in August of '65. And as the police judge, he had seen any number of charges of so-called vagrancy where refugees had been arrested by local civil authorities and tried to be prosecuted, sometimes re-enslaved, other times ejected from the state. So he'd seen a lot of the legal processes local civil authorities were trying to deal with this refugee population. The cases were about the same as they were in Bourbon County for enticing slaves to escape under antebellum legislation, of course. But Judge Johnston wanted to take his time in issuing a ruling because he knew that a number of the former Confederate states had restarted their legislative sessions, and by virtue of the deals along which they could come into the Union, they had to pass the 13th Amendment. So he delayed all day on December 5th, which was General Palmer's day in court, waiting for news to come up the telegraph line about Alabama, which was set to vote that day. And right around sundown, news came in that Alabama had ratified the 13th Amendment, making it almost a certainty that 2/3 of the states would ratify it and that it would become an amendment to the Constitution. So after word was received, Johnston dismisses the case. Palmer walks out of the courtroom and looks down from the rotunda down into the courthouse and notices that every square inch of the building had been crammed with Black refugees waiting on word of the case, knowing how much hinged upon it. And he shouted down to the gathered crowd, "A Kentucky judge has declared you all free. Thank him." News didn't officially pass that the 13th Amendment was the law of the land until December 6th, though it had been passed by Congress on January 31st of 1865. Again, they're waiting for all of the final votes to come in from the returning Confederate states. Alabama, North Carolina, and Georgia were the final votes to happen in December. Kentucky, of course, we have to remember, was still under the control of Unionists, though slave-owning and slave-supporting white supremacist Unionists for the most part. So for our part, our General Assembly had rejected the 13th Amendment when it first came to them in early 1865. They'd reject it again for good measure in the session that had just come in December of 1865. And it wouldn't be until 1976 that Kentucky would finally ratify the 13th Amendment. We were second to last behind Mississippi, which took until 1995. Then the next day, December 7th, 1865, Palmer was finally able to issue the order that he had been teasing for the better part of 9 months. He says, "Whatever doubts may have heretofore existed on the subject, slavery has now ceased to exist in Kentucky, and with it fall all the laws of the state heretofore in force intended for its support." Of course, just as it was for those people who participated in Juneteenth in Texas, for freed people all across the South, there was still a long struggle to wrest civil rights beyond mere freedom from state governments, which were still in the hands at that time of slave owners all across the South before congressional reconstruction, and here in Kentucky, which would remain in the hands of loyal slave owners. In Kentucky, the black right of testimony against white people was not extended until the Freedmen's Bureau threatened to prosecute Klan and other vigilante murders in federal courts. That is to say, black testimony was only allowed in Kentucky courts when juries could be packed with sympathetic whites who would guarantee acquittals for racially motivated crimes. Suffrage, likewise, for black men in Kentucky wouldn't come until 1870 with the 15th Amendment. And even that was met with paramilitary violence led by the Kentucky militia, armed with state weapons to suppress black votes and Republican Party meetings. All of which brings us back to the conclusion that we started with at the beginning of the presentation. Juneteenth reminds us that no matter where we come from, our background, our identity, freedoms on paper always have to be seized and affirmed again and again. With that, I'll hop off and take questions from everybody. I know we've got some good ones in the chat.
We have some really good ones in the chat. Patrick, thank you for an absolutely marvelous presentation. It was outstanding.
Thank you.
Okay, first, and some of these you've answered, but I think it would be useful to go back and revisit what you've said in the context of these questions. Please discuss why the Emancipation Proclamation was not already in effect in Kentucky after it was signed in 1863.
That's a really excellent question. So Lincoln wants to keep Kentucky politicians on side, and he recognizes that slavery is foundational to Union support in Kentucky. That Kentuckians by and large had remained loyal to the Union because they understood that slavery was best protected with the power of the Constitution, the power of the Fugitive Slave Law. If Kentucky joins the Confederacy, then the Ohio River becomes an international border, and there will be no recourse to pursue fugitive slaves across. Kentuckians want no part, by and large, about 2/3 of them want no part of joining the Confederacy. But if the Lincoln administration starts to go down a road of emancipation anywhere, quite frankly, but especially in Kentucky, especially the emancipating the slaves of loyal men in Kentucky, then Union support is going to plummet. The state could secede in the middle of the war, and Lincoln would be left with a viper's nest in the middle of his supply depot. So for that reason, and Kentucky is not alone in this. There are other loyal parts of the South which were then under Union control, parts of Tennessee, parts of Louisiana, which were also exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation. And it really is a military order that allows the Union Army to follow the logic of war that proceeded from the Confiscation Acts, that enslaved human property was a war asset of the Confederacy and could therefore be seized because the Confederacy was using that labor to wage war. So those people could be emancipated in the same way that you would seize cannons and ammunition from a Confederate supply depot. But loyal slave owners in Kentucky refused that. And so that meant that freedom, quite frankly, came last to Black Kentuckians of anywhere in the country.
Can you also explain the history of Kentucky not joining the secession?
Yeah, it's a very fascinating history. Of course, there are secessionists in Kentucky, and they formed their own state government, which has a secession convention in Russellville, which sets up a state government in Bowling Green, which for the first winter of the war in 1861-62 governs the southern part of the state, supported by the Confederate Army. But as the Confederates are driven out of Kentucky in February of 1862, after the battles of Mill Springs and Fort Donelson, that Confederate government of Kentucky never does again actually exert any control or power, political power in the state. They try during the Perryville campaign to install a Confederate governor in Frankfort, but he's there for less than a day before, again, they're forced out of the state. There is constant Confederate representation in the Confederate Congress in Richmond, and Confederate Kentucky politicians, not only those elected from the state, but those who had been born in the state and then moved, often chasing cotton and sugar lands into places like Louisiana and Texas and Arkansas, which had Kentucky ties, formed this really important block in Confederate politics. But as best we can tell, secessionists are only about 1/3 of Kentucky's white population. About 2/3 of the state supports the Union, and that number will waver in the face of the recruitment of Black men into the U.S. Army, in the face of sort of looming emancipation in 1864 and 65. Lots of white Kentuckians become really, really disgusted at Lincoln himself, at the Republican Party, and at the United States. And so there's lots of growing Confederate sentiment the closer and closer we get to emancipation. And that is directly tied to the steps towards freedom that the Lincoln administration is taking.
Wow. This is a question that I'd like to hear you respond to. Palmer's role is fascinating, which brings me to ask your view on the matter circulating now about ways white people can most appropriately celebrate this new holiday that heretofore has almost wholly been within the Black experience.
Yeah, that really is important. This has been a tension in Civil War history writing for probably, well, since James McPherson and Battle Cry of Freedom, right? So probably for the last 3 or 4 decades, about this tension between who causes emancipation. Is it Lincoln and the generals who are forcing these policies, who are enacting these laws, who are bringing freedom in the van of the Union Army, or is it the pressure from Black people themselves who demand these policies get passed, who flee the sites of their bondage and run themselves into Union Army camps and create a humanitarian crisis that demands responding to, that then prompts these proclamations and general orders and eventually laws, right? And so there's this push-pull between white administrators and Black people on the ground pushing and seizing freedom. And so I feel like there's going to be some of that in Juneteenth, right? The very holiday itself is this moment where Gordon Granger reads this proclamation out to a gathered crowd. Now you think of the balance of the characters on the stage here. There's one white man and a few thousand Black people gathered out in the crowd. So that seems to think, to me at least, that we should center the experiences of the vast majority of people who experience freedom. But we also need to recognize, I think particularly now, in a time where civil rights, voting rights, et cetera, seem to be under assault, that there is a role for both sort of administration and also activists to interact and produce something that's of benefit to everyone.
Perhaps another way to address that question would be that Juneteenth could possibly become a day of listening by white folks to Black folks and learning.
Yeah.
And deep, serious conversations.
I feel very Yeah, no, I feel very much that is the case, in the same way that Martin Luther King Jr. Day has become a day of service for lots of businesses and community organizations. I feel like that could be the role of Juneteenth as well. I know a lot of my friends who work in public history organizations and the National Park Service and at various museums have been thinking a lot about the types of programming that they want to offer today and tomorrow. And then how that is affected by this now becoming a national holiday. And again, there's this hunger to know more because of this knowledge about this process of emancipation. Again, for the reasons that I quoted from Annette Gordon-Reed and Ty Sedgley, we seem to have lost, who have been hidden from us, to have fallen out of our curriculum and our public memory, and that needs to be restored. It's not that this is history revision. This is an expansion of our knowledge, of our public understanding of the meaning of the Civil War and its effects.
It's not replacing one history with another history. It's taking a history that's been imparted and passed down and adding to it an equally rich strand that has been missing. Is that a good way to put it?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's right.
Patrick, what new research needs to be done to tell the story of emancipation in Kentucky?
Yeah, and there's some of this work that's being done right now. We need to understand. Quite frankly, we need to put faces and names with these crowds of refugees. This human wave of misery that gets reported in these military administrative documents as a nameless, faceless group of individuals who are facing smallpox and starvation and legal harassment, et cetera. And there are ways to do that. digital tools now available to us that have not been previously available in the past allow us to create name indexes of Freedmen's Bureau records, of U.S. Army records, of the records of Camp Nelson, of Black enlistment records that can help us start to understand. And then once we know who these people are on the ground in 1864 and 1865, then hopefully we can look forward and trace those individuals as they go and seek freedom, as they appear in the 1870 census, for example, which is the first time that Black people are named consistently in the census. Whereas in the old antebellum slave schedules, they were only a gender, skin color, and an age. So there are ways that we need to be using these tools that we now have available to us to start to follow those stories out, and not only to create sort of overall demographic trends about migration and employment and health outcomes. All of those things could be known, but then also to look for really compelling stories that can be used to inspire us, quite frankly, because these people are just seeking the rights that all Americans continue to want for themselves.
There's so much conversation about Civil War monuments today. How should we remember the end of slavery in Kentucky?
Fortunately, we have one of the best ways to do that. We have a new National Park Service site that does that. Camp Nelson was a few years ago added to the National Park Service system. That visitor center just opened this week, and really is symbolically like the spot that created freedom for the vast majority of Black Kentuckians. So Camp Nelson, it's just south of Nicholasville, probably about half hour south of Lexington. Was a major supply depot before in 1863 and 64, before Black recruitment, and then it becomes really the site where enslaved people from the Bluegrass go to enlist and then seek freedom. And there was this sort of rich culture of social services set up and managed by the government, but also set up and managed by charitable organizations from the North and elsewhere to provide health care, to provide food, to provide literacy training. Berea College and the Fees came over and taught countless numbers of enslaved people how to read and write there at Camp Nelson. And all of this infrastructure was built up, beautiful buildings, hospitals, housing for soldiers and their families. And then almost as soon as the war ended, all of that was torn down and done away with. And so it was this brief moment of promise, and it really does symbolize, I think, the retreat of the federal government from the promises that were made to African Americans during the Civil War. But that's our new monument. That's our state monument to emancipation. And we now have a place to go for school field trips and things like that. That having been said, there are countless stories here in Louisville. I focused on the Louisville story, that there are local manifestations of this, and that's just going to take some sustained research to understand how that process took place in places like Northern Kentucky and places like Paducah and Hopkinsville, Bowling Green, all these other places that we know there were large refugee communities seeking freedom in the same way.
There are two local permanent exhibitions that I find very moving and helpful. One is down the street from us at University of Louisville campus, honoring Blaine Hudson and other civil rights leaders, and telling basically a history of the civil rights movement post-Civil War in this state. But then the other monument, so to speak, that I find really moving is the Ed Hamilton series of sculptures on Lincoln's life, which are down at Waterfront Park. What's the best book or the best series of books on the history of slavery in Kentucky?
Oh, I tell you, we need a new good one. The standard work that everyone still refers to, though people have done regional studies of slavery in Kentucky, our still standing statewide survey is J. Winston Coleman's Slavery Times in Kentucky, published in the early 1940s. And as you might imagine, that interpretation is dated. And could stand a great deal of updating. Now, there are some fantastic micro studies. You know, the Filson has published those. Again, you mentioned Wade Hudson, who was writing studies of slavery in Louisville and surrounding counties in the 1990s that we were publishing. Ohio Valley History is full of these all across the region. I like to say that the best book on slavery in Kentucky is a book about slavery in Missouri. By a professor named Diane Moody Burke, called On Slavery's Border. And it really does dive into the ways that slavery manifests itself on small slave holding farms, which is, again, that's the more common reality in Kentucky than the large scale cotton plantation elsewhere in the Deep South. And she's able to show in really perceptive and sensitive ways how intimate that slavery is, and I don't mean that in a positive light. How close, how claustrophobic, how supervised, observed, and oftentimes violent that sort of interaction could be. I know we've got a lot of great historians who are working on slavery in Kentucky right now. I'm expecting that with the interest of the University Press of Kentucky, and organizations like the Clark Foundation, who are really looking to invest in research in Black history in Kentucky, will get that book here soon. I hope we get to edit some of the articles.
There are three things I'd point out, three of them. One, well, there's a 2-volume series on slavery and post-slavery in Kentucky, one by Marion Lucas and one by George C. Wright. That I found very, very useful in my studying. And then for me, the primary source material, narratives, interviews conducted by the Works Progress Administration, the WPA in 1941 and 42, of former people who had been enslaved or their children who were part of it and understood it. There are 32 of those narratives. I've now read all of them. It would take you about 2 hours, 3 hours to read them seriously, and one walks away from those narratives in a state of shock. And so I would add Lucas, Dr. Lucas, who teaches at Western, or is now, I think, emeritus. Dr. Wright, who was formerly a president of an HBCU in Texas, the largest one there, and now is back on the faculty of UK at the history department. And then the WPA narratives. To me, those right now are the authoritative works, but the works by Lucas and Wright are what, 20 years old or thereabouts?
More.
Patrick, we have 4 minutes to go. Is there anything that you would like to add at this point?
Anything I would like to add? I'm really excited, honestly, about the level of our knowledge about the end of slavery in Kentucky. I was thinking about, what books we have about Reconstruction. There's been a really fantastic outpouring in the past decade of really good sustained work about the process that unfolded after Emancipation, about the establishment and relative success of the Freedmen's Bureau, despite extreme harassment by the state government. in establishing schools in Kentucky, in raising the Black literacy rate and training Black teachers to hand those schools over to. Unfortunately, that was shut down prematurely due to the harassment of the state government. But we have this really excellent sense now of the challenges that were mounted to these claims to rights, particularly in Kentucky. And again, recognizing our anomalous state in the South as being this largest loyal slave state, and unfortunately coming up with a legal playbook that other states in the Deep South, as conservative whites took over their state governments again, then used to erect a Jim Crow state. And those came with a lot of Kentucky influence who were testing those laws out. And we now understand that. We also understand, I think, that the special challenges in Kentucky and our proximity to being able to cross into perhaps less racially hostile, though still perilous territory north of the Ohio River, led to a massive outmigration of Black Kentuckians out of this state. And one of the challenges for us as public historians, as educators, will be to find Black histories in certain counties of this state which have very little Black population today, which the population has migrated out, and there are not those large communities to advocate for the telling of that history, which we're so fortunate to have in places like Louisville and Lexington and Northern Kentucky and our larger cities. So that's going to be one of our challenges, is to find the will as a state to confront these narratives and to keep talking about them.
Couple of quick follow-up things with reference to the slave narratives. They're all contained on the website of the Library of Congress, and you can simply Google Library of Congress, WPA slave narratives, and it'll come right up. They are from all of the states, but the 32 of Kentucky are pretty easy to find once you get on that website. And then a suggestion from Charles Bogart, located in Frankfort's Green Hill Cemetery is a monument to African Americans from Franklin County who served in the USCT that was erected by the Women Relief Corps. So with that, Patrick, absolutely cannot thank you enough. This has been a very engaging presentation, and I think we all learned a lot. I'd like to wish everybody a happy Juneteenth, and let's move forward. Thank you. Bye.